Welcome to Coaching Uncaged by Animas, the podcast that explores the art, science, and career of coaching. And now, introducing your host and interviewer, Yannick Jacob.
All right. Wonderful. Dr. Ilona Boniwell, Professor Ilona Boniwell. For me, I met you as Dr. Ed. We go back more than 16 years now. I'm so happy that you've made time to be on our podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you, Yannick. I'm actually really happy to be here and be talking to you as well. So yes, we met many years back, and we're still very much in contact and collaborating. So that's a pleasure.
Yeah, I love it. There's been a very long history. I remember vividly having this Ilona lady as running the undergrad module in positive psychology, which I was lucky enough happened at the university I was currently studying positive psychology at. And then I asked this Ilona lady, who was no name to me, and say, hey, I hear there is one master's in the world to study positive psychology with Martin Seligman in Pennsylvania. Can you tell me more? And you said, well, there's another one now. It's in Europe. It's with me, and we're starting cohort 2 in September. So that was kind of my story of how I fell into positive psychology and, the science of what's right with people. And turns out I was sitting at the source, just the European source, and that was with you. So ever since, we've been in touch, and you've done so much, right? You've been involved with various master's programs in positive psychology, really a pioneering figure to bring this movement to a somewhat more critical landscape here in Europe. So at the heart of the second wave, and you've delivered countless keynotes, you've edited and co-wrote books, you've published widely, lots of journal articles. You've then moved to France. You've been quite instrumental in the French movement in positive psychology. You've worked with governments in Tibet, in Dubai, actively applying positive psychology principles at governmental level. You've worked in countless organizations at the time where positive psychology, I remember you saying, oh yeah, and then they said, that all sounds great, but could we not use the words positive and psychology, please? So you've been on the floor applying these principles, and you've pushing them forward academically. So just for other people to kind of get a bit of a sense who's talking, I wonder if there's anything you would add to that, or anything that would be helpful for people to know in terms of where you're speaking from.
Well, I think what's really important is the fact that what I'm really very much passionate nowadays is really up the application, because I started very much as an academic and now have really become a practitioner. So my move, which is an unusual move, was from academia to practitioner. So I'm still an academic, I'm still very active in research, I'm still publishing, I'm still doing lots and lots of different things. But fundamentally, my heart is in practice, and my heart is making sure that somehow with positive psychology, we can make a difference to the world. So this is what I'm really passionate about. And so I think I was quite faithful to this principle for now quite a number of years. So that's probably the most important. And obviously my clients and my wonderful clients, I would say, and wonderful projects, and being able to go back and actually say, yes, we did this and we changed something and this actually made a difference. So that's probably the heart of it. And of course there are books, and of course there are academic publications, but I think it's really making the difference on the ground that matters to me.
Yeah, and we definitely have that in common. And I think we have that a lot in common with a lot of coaches out there, because coaches are at the heart applied. And the ones that are evidence-based, it's applied science. But science in the ivory tower of academia doesn't make sense unless we actually bring it to the people and see what sticks.
No. Yeah, I remember precisely all those conversations. It's like those first and second cohort of MAP students coming out saying, Ilona, that was absolutely great. It was marvelous. We learned so much. Just how do we apply it?
No words.
I was like, to begin with, I was like, can't you see? I mean, you have all the theory, just go and apply it. And then I realized myself that it's not quite as simple. You don't just take the theory and apply it. There is really the art of practice, and this art of practice is extremely important. Maybe there is science, but the art of practice is as important as the scientific underpinnings.
Yeah, exactly. And coaching is really where that comes alive. I want to take a good couple of steps back. because we are very familiar, obviously. We could easily kind of geek out on the intricacies of applying that, but I want to take a few steps back and just create the connection first.
Absolutely.
I want to pick you up on an article you wrote way back in 2006. You were citing Carol Kaufman and Ann Schooler saying that coaching is the natural ally in positive psychology. And there's a number of people who really made this connection early, that it seems that coaches and positive psychologists seem to look in the same direction or work in a particular way. Why do you think it makes so much sense? Why is it such a natural ally?
Yeah, I mean, I still believe it's probably the most natural ally of positive psychology, because fundamentally positive psychology is a theoretical and a scientific discipline, and it needs hands and basically to make something happen. And for me, the application arm of positive psychology is first and foremost coaching. So it is really the place where we can take these ideas and actually test them in reality, see if they work, see if they make a difference. It's probably not the only ally, because I think training is another very important ally of positive psychology, and consultancy, of course, as well. But I think the fundamental ally is coaching, and this is including individual coaching and group coaching as well. And I think also for coaching, positive psychology is extremely helpful and useful, because in fact, it's thanks to positive psychology that we can make sense of why certain things we know work actually work. So giving it the kind of this theoretical backbone, that's I think what positive psychology provides fundamentally to coaching. It's explaining why things work, how things work, and sometimes stretching coaching as well to go a little bit further perhaps, and to see how else some of the solutions can be implemented. So I think that is again very, very important.
Yeah, could you give us a brief insights about the things, right? What are we studying in positive psychology?
Oh my God, so many. What we're studying well-being, we're studying performance, we're studying the integration between well-being and performance. And in fact, for example, in most of my coaching conversations with at C-level with many CEOs, it is this very integration between well-being and performance is very often the key question. How do I function extremely well, and at the same time I manage to recover, and I do manage to flourish somehow at a personal level? So this integration is key. And of course, this integration is what Tony Grant pointed towards in the third generation of coaching. And so for me, basically positive psychology is completely matching with this third generation of coaching, the integration of the two. And of course, there are so many different other topics. We're talking about motivation, we're talking about time use, we are talking about our talents, we're talking about our strengths, we're talking about wisdom, we're talking about emotional intelligence. In fact, the list is kind of almost endless. It's almost, you take all the topics from non-clinical psychological literature, and you'll find that positive psychology has quite a lot to say about it.
And it's interesting because we've talked about this for like almost 2 decades, and I hear how much time you've spent in organizations since, because now it sounds very relevant to organizations. So we're talking about performance, and we're talking about wisdom, and we're talking about time use. There's been some considerable history in making relevant links between positive psychological topics. When we talk about character strength and positive emotions and psychological well-being, it's not necessarily immediately obvious how these kind of research topics link to organizational performance, right? So can you tell us a bit of the journey of positive psychology as a field of study that started out with something that could sound quite fluffy if you were just to look at a list of topics, to being accepted in organizations as something that makes a tangible difference to people?
I think, yes, I think I'll tell you, I would say, about the story of positive psychology, but also I think there is also a transformation in positive psychology journey as well that leads us to where we are and being relevant to organizations. So first of all, positive psychology started very much in 1998 with Martin Seligman, with his focus on how can we possibly add some research to topics that usually only personal development was looking into up until now. And yes, these topics did sound a bit fluffy, like character strengths and well-being. And I think with years, of course, a lot of research has been added to this topic. So I think we used to say that depression was studied so many times more than, let's say, well-being. I think nowadays it's simply not the case any longer. I think probably well-being is being studied more than depression, if you look at all the numbers. But also, as positive psychology developed, it also adapted far more to different domains. So there is very rich positive psychology as applied to education nowadays. And we're not talking just in general teaching concepts of happiness to children, but we are talking about all the complexity of psychosocial skill development and making sure that the skills become embedded and not just taught through simple lessons, for example, but embedded in the culture, in school culture, for example, in the whole school approach, through a toolbox approach. So it became much more comprehensive. And the same thing happened, I would say, in organizations and with the organizational angle of positive psychology. So when I go and talk to an organization, I would not be talking about character strengths, for example, as much as I absolutely love character strengths idea. I'll be talking about strengths that enable better performance, and I'll be probably utilizing some of the classifications and measures which are far more performance and workplace oriented. When I'm going to organizations, I'll be talking about not just well-being in general, but rather about maybe perhaps well-being standards and how does a workplace satisfy those well-being standards. And we'll be going much further, not just talking about psychological and managerial standards. We'll be perhaps considering how managerial and psychological standards can be integrated with, for example, space standards at the same time. So when we talk about change, I think positive psychology has a very big role to play in change management initiatives, because it's adding this very important bit on why important bit addressing why change management initiatives usually fail. So it's actually really focusing on human beings' satisfaction of some of their basic needs, understanding their emotional journey through change, making sure that we integrate behavioral economics or nudge approaches, for example, to how they handle change, or different, more positively focused change management approaches to just appreciative inquiry. So I think it's not that just that the workplace became more open to these ideas. It is also that positive psychology has become much more attuned and much more relevant to the workplace as well. And the language became much more integrated. So it's not just, again, positive psychology, it's really positive psychology plus more traditional change management, plus organizational psychology, fundamentally, and other related disciplines that are working together to address the actual workplace needs.
Yeah, and we started having data to say, hey, look, if we take better care of your employees' psychological well-being, they will sell more.
Absolutely.
If we take measures to create environments in schools where kids can psychologically flourish, they also achieve better grades. And in the beginning, we didn't have this kind of data. So it was difficult to even get it to the level of decision makers who could then allocate some funding for it.
Absolutely. But it's the measures, it's the outcomes. Of course, all of this is really important, but it's also the value added, the specific value added of more positive psychology-based initiatives in comparison to, let's say, more traditional initiatives as well. So I think that's also very, very important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's circle back to coaching, because I always found it tricky in research to single out coaching as the intervention that actually shifted this with a degree of confidence that would be like really pinpointing, like, oh, yes, it was the coaching intervention.
Yeah.
Difficult to set positive psychology coaching apart from other types of coaching. And it's somewhat more difficult to say it was the coaching that made the difference. Much easier when we say, oh, here's an intervention. At the same time, interventions don't work so well when it's like a workshop or a piece of training or a piece of consulting. So I'm not sure what the question in there is. I wondered why focus on coaching rather than these other type of ways to apply positive psychology to the workplace.
Mm. No, I think it's not necessarily focus on coaching specifically for me. I think the focus on coaching is relevant to when we are working on one-to-one basically approaches, then it is positive psychology coaching. Otherwise, it can be positive psychology training or positive psychology consultancy or positive, or let's say positively based, not necessarily of the psychology consultancy approaches. So coaching is only specifically relevant for one-to-one or specifically coaching type group interventions. So, of course, we can also distinguish group coaching from a training approach as well, because training is much more top down, potentially involving a lot of interactivity, but you do have a predetermined agenda to which you stick. Whilst when I'm doing group coaching, it is far more question based. What question are we trying to explore together? And it is much more about facilitation rather than top down in any way, shape, or form content delivery. So I think, yes, it's coaching, probably that was the pioneer, I would say, in shifting the perception of positive psychology as something relevant to organizations. Yes, because I think coaching was probably the first one to react very enthusiastically as well to positive psychology and the first one to try. But it is not just coaching. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You have different methodologies which are all of relevance.
Yeah. So really one of the tenets is that we approach people development with a lens of what's already going well, what could we build on, has gone well for other people
Yeah.
or for this person in the past.
Absolutely.
What could we recreate? What can we learn
Yeah.
from? And I think
Yeah.
many coaches will have that naturally, but I think a
Yes.
lot of coaches are still very problem oriented, and that's okay, right? We need
Yeah.
people who focus on problems and how we can fix them. And
Absolutely.
just because we work with positive psychology doesn't mean that we're going to ignore all the problems.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what you were talking about in the beginning as, it is an integration.
It is, absolutely. And I think where positive psychology perhaps is different is in a very explicit utilization of strengths, which is the way it is different, I would say, is obviously many coaches nowadays integrate strengths, some strengths questioning into the approach. Absolutely. But it's kind of more touch and go approach. So I'll talk about strengths once. What are strengths? How can you bring them? What's positive psychology coaching doing more differently? Or for example, what I'm doing perhaps differently, I will spend a lot more time really focusing on strengths from different perspectives, getting the person to fully acknowledge and appropriate their strengths, get to kind of almost a definitive list almost of strengths, and then very deliberately bringing them back into problem solving, into goal setting, into solution finding, etc., etc. So I think it's a more deliberate and a more consistent approach focusing on strengths. That's probably the way the difference lies.
Yeah, and there's a couple of hints in there that really go at the heart of a question I wanted to ask, and I think probably now's the right time, which is the how to apply this, right? Because in coaching schools, generally, we're being taught, well, your opinion, what you know, it doesn't really matter. So the coach shouldn't bring themselves into the client's journey or add information. And I think that's broadening a lot. And when we bring something in like positive psychology, we know a lot of what makes a difference and what maybe doesn't make a difference for most people most of the time, right? We have a lot of data. So
Absolutely.
I heard our colleague, Dr. Susie Green, propose the idea that as positive psychology coaches, we have an obligation to bring in what we know from the science. So I'm curious.
Very interesting.
Many different ways to apply positive psychology within a coaching frame, right? I'm curious to maybe hear a couple of stories, examples even, of how you bring in positive psychology when you work with clients as a coach, and how informative or how even guiding can it be?
Yeah. I mean, it is, I think, a really interesting question, because the fundamental difference between positive psychology and coaching is that coaching, fundamentally in coaching, support is highly personalized, and it's very much based on the individual assuming the ownership and responsibility for all their decision making. Whilst in positive psychology, there are some answers which are helpful. And so, yes, we do bring a huge amount of knowledge into our coaching session. And in a sense, the right answer is partly based on some of the results of research. But how can you bring them into coaching conversation without saying, oh, no, okay, research is showing that, why don't you go and do this, which is kind of completely anti-coaching because you are suddenly becoming prescriptive. So this is, I think, a really key question. And I've been playing with it quite a lot. And my own solution, I'm not saying it's the right solution, I'm not saying it's the only solution, but my own solution is the development and integration of different tools into the coaching process. And the tools which enable still a lot of client ownership, whilst at the same time using some of the tools to suggest some approaches which could potentially be helpful. So, for example, in you know this one, I think, in the initial sort of diagnostic stages, I would use a lot of happiness dashboard type of conversations, which is basically
just for those who are listening to this, jump over to YouTube. You can see it. It's a two-folded page, so you can flip it apart, and it's laminated, right? So you can use on it in markers. And there's all sorts of assessment around where you're at. I'll let you take over from here, just so people have an image of what you're holding.
Yes. For those listening, it's basically a 2-page visual solution of lots of different well-being indicators, such as energy level, emotion reservoir, time balance, ladder of life, which is life satisfaction, etc. And what it allows us to do is this is not about using a usual approach to scaling or to scales, basically psychological scales, but rather something visual that you can draw on. And what we use it for is really as a conversation springboard, because I can ask you what's your energy level like and to what extent you're satisfied with your life, and you'll give me some of the answers. But by drawing on it, in fact, all of these are psychological indicators known from science, by drawing on this dashboard and by actually having a conversation based on these visual indicators, the conversation becomes far, far richer and goes far deeper as well at the same time. So at the same time, it's basically using the science to put the indicators there. It's using something very tangible, interactive methodology. By the way, same thing can be used online as well. And fundamentally enabling us to have a far deeper conversation. Or you already mentioned this idea of positive psychology intervention. Positive psychology intervention is basically having lots of relatively simple things to do, which actually lastingly increase our well-being. Like, for example, counting your blessings, or doing something kind for somebody else, or having a little meditation, mindfulness meditation routine, for example. Again, if we were sort of just talking, I'm stuck with either asking you for all different solutions you might have for your well-being, or suggesting a solution to you top down. Whilst if I'm using a tool, so here I'm holding a box called positive actions, which is basically full of lots of different intervention cards based on positive psychology, with a lot of different descriptions behind, sort of very clear descriptions. By using cards, I'm actually giving you, the client, the responsibility of playing with them, having a look, seeing if there is anything that's interesting for you, picking up perhaps something and saying, actually, that makes sense, and this is how I would use it perhaps. So you are still autonomous in the choice making, but at the same time, you are working with science-generated solutions at the same time, without me suggesting to you what to do. And we have actually run studies around it. And what we found is that when we enable individuals to choose their own well-being schedule, for example, well-being solutions, their well-being really does increase in comparison to prescribing solutions, which is what usually we would do in research studies. We would say, okay, why don't you now try to respond in an active, constructive way? to some news, and then we'll basically monitor you a week later or 6 weeks later to see if your well-being increased. So here you are in charge. The client is in charge, yet we are working with something. We are working with something that has been generated through research. And so this is fundamentally my solution. The same would go with strengths, for example, exactly the same approach would be for strengths. If I asked you what strengths you have, if you are very familiar with the strengths language, you would come up with some answers. Obviously, I can ask you different other questions. What were you great at when you were a child? What do you enjoy doing the most? Where do you see yourself going in the future, etc.? There are lots of other different indirect ways to generate the strengths. But fundamentally, many people are quite limited in their strengths language. They'll not come up with the strengths of personalization, for example, or woo, or adventure, for example, as a strength, or explaining or curiosity, etc. They'll be stuck quite a lot of the time. Again, when I offer them a possibility of choosing strengths, for example, using again different cards like strengths cards, their language changes. They actually get to some very concrete point. So that's what I love doing. I love using tools as stimuli, not as an end result, but as stimuli for further conversation and for decision making.
Yeah, and literally putting those tools on the table rather than prescribing them. They're on
Exactly.
the table either as a conglomeration of graphics that are,
Exactly.
that where you can play with, get
Exactly.
involved, lay them
Exactly.
out,
Exactly.
hand them over. And they're all evidence-based rather than just
And the, yeah,
a group of strengths that I've come across and liked.
yeah, exactly. They're all evidence-based. Exactly. And I love all the language that they are using behind here. So hand it over, pick it up, etc. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And so it becomes, again, conversation becomes deeper. And what's interesting, again, then going back to clients' autonomy, clients can also come up with their own strengths, and very often based on what they're seeing, saying, okay, that talks to me, but maybe just to specify it a bit more, what I'm really doing really well is, and they go even further. So there is also the deepening of the conversation as it progresses.
Yeah. How do you navigate what to put on the table? I mean, we talked about strength and also psychological well-being. I mean, there's some areas in positive psychology that have now, 25 years of research behind them, under the hood of positive psychology, potentially some was research from before. But there is a replication crisis, meaning that there's a lot of research that is difficult to replicate. And so the first waves of research might not be as solid as many people would have liked them to be, which
Yeah.
makes sense because research process takes a long time. And it's much more
Absolutely.
exciting to research something new than to replicate something that we already know to see if it still holds
Yeah.
up with a different group of people. And
Yeah.
that's now gets a bit sciencey. Maybe there's not so many science geeks in the audience,
Yeah.
but we kind of are as we are applying them.
Yeah.
I always found it difficult to say, well, it's not something that we know because we have good evidence in science. The person in front of you might just be the outlier to everything that we know. And so something that might not work for most people most of the time might really work for them.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate what you put on the table based on the limitations of science as a
I
way
mean,
of knowing things?
yes, absolutely. At some point, you just, in a sense, make a decision, but again, make a decision that's based on something, I would say. So what my decision is usually based on, for example, in developing this positive actions box, the decision was based on meta-analysis. So only interventions that went through meta-analysis and were demonstrated to be effective were included.
Maybe
And
just a
this
side note that a meta-analysis is a study that looks at all studies that have been done in a particular area, very well chosen, very well defined what's chosen and what doesn't make the cut, and then pulling together all of these bundles of research into
Exactly.
what are the themes across 100 different studies.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So basically, meta-analysis enables us to see which interventions are really successful, especially when you have 3, 2, 4, 10 studies looking into the same intervention. And nowadays, there are a lot of meta-analysis, and there is even a mega analysis, of meta-analysis of positive psychology interventions. And so we're actually, for example, updating the deck at the moment to make sure that only some of the most important interventions with specific limitations actually make the cut. So this is, again, the decision is science-based, even though science is work in progress. But for example, to give you a different idea, which probably will be a bit more confusing, when I talked about post-psychology interventions, I'm talking about more post-psychology interventions at the individual level. But then when we are working with organizations, I mean, it might sound really great, let's say, counting strengths and creating your family strengths tree as one of the interventions. But frankly speaking, it's not terribly relevant to the vast majority of organizations because it is really an individual level intervention. Mm-hmm. So when I'm talking to, basically when I'm coaching organizations or coaching groups of people, very often organizations, I'm using a very different set of tools with, again, different criteria, and I'll talk about that. So in fact, what I'm focusing on is specifically identifying interventions that are impactful and important in the organizational domain. And so here, for example, I developed another game. It's called Workup, or nowadays Whoop for ease of pronunciation, which includes, to be precise, 180 organizational level interventions. Now, the important part is the science is probably not quite at the same level at the organizational level intervention in comparison with individual level. Individual level, we are quite certain that even your family strengths tree is a very impactful intervention. At the organizational level, there are lots of different interventions coming from organizational domain, from psychological, obviously, domains, from actually what organizations do. So what I'm doing here instead, I still identify lots of different interventions, such as, I don't know, let's say, eliminating bureaucracy, or making sure people are free to act, or result level training, or job rotation, etc., or many different interventions. But then with the explanation that the science is probably not quite as robust. So we have references, I have references on each card. Some of these references are of direct relevance, some not. But also I'm looking at what organizations are using that. So if there are organizations that are using this particular intervention, maybe there is something in it. So it's about basically putting your limitations out. There are many interventions, there are organizations using it. There is some good research underpinning many of the suggestions, but probably the quality of the science is not quite at the same level. Nevertheless, if we take these ideas or these interventions as building blocks almost, as stepping stones, what we also take into account is almost like a hypothesis. This is a hypothesis that this intervention may work. And so you're also very free to adapt them, to adjust them, to try them out, to almost use your organization as a learning club to see which of these interventions make sense. Because frankly speaking, one of the books, for example, that influenced me the most recently is Rituals at Work. I don't know, have you come across this book?
Not read it, no.
Yeah, Rituals at Work, it's actually a book and also research study, basically looking at the use of not necessarily just interventions, but actually more things which become more like ritualistic type of behavior. Mm-hmm. And this is actually very, very new in terms of research. By the way, the Rituals at Work, I'll just give you the name of the authors, is Kusat Ozeng and Margaret Hagan. So it's very, very new in terms of research. But what it's basically saying, it's not necessarily just one-off intervention that makes a difference, but what really does make a difference is when we sort of create some rituals and they really sort of interventions, and we kind of use them in a really ritualized manner. For example, things like moose on a table, or it can be elephant in a room or something like this, which is, the ritual is very simple. You have a moose, like, with horns, like a toy moose standing somewhere on the shelf, or you can instead pick up an elephant, like a toy, let's say Lego elephant, and you put it on the shelf. And it's your ritual. And you actually agree that whenever we are in a meeting, and something is not being said, instead of sort of in an awkward way saying, listen, there is something underlying here, people can just get up, pick up the moose or the elephant as a toy and put it on the table.
Yes, something
And that's
we're not
our
talking
ritual
about,
between ourselves,
but in a playful way.
in a playful way, to indicate we need to go deeper here, for example. It's a ritual, you see?
Yeah.
or,
Well, I've
or
seen it in families work super well. Lots of parents have started doing,
Yeah.
things we're grateful for at before the dessert is
Yeah.
served or something like that.
exactly.
It's
Exactly.
ritualizing something that we know
Yeah.
from positive psychology works quite well, but finding an
Exactly.
appropriate space and making sure it happens regularly, because
Yeah.
otherwise it's just a one-time intervention.
Absolutely. And the science, I would say, there isn't that much science behind the idea of ritual yet. But what I'm observing, for example, when I go to workplaces, is that these type of rituals work extremely well. So I think the bottom line here, to answer your question, how do I decide what to put on the table, is that there are different levels of decision making.
Yeah.
But it's better to put something on the table and to start playing with it and developing from that basis than to sit and wait for another 10 years until the science becomes definitive.
Yeah, and
That would be my, I would say, very pragmatic approach to facilitating ideas building.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, right? I'm a big fan of tapping into the natural resourcefulness of a client, right? And
Yeah.
really have them come up with the answers and trust that they can come up with
Yeah.
the right answers. In reality, clients really appreciate it if the coach is someone with usually some expertise in a particular
Yes.
area. Not always, it's not always needed.
Yes.
But if you have some stuff that you can put on
Yeah.
the table, put it on the table and work in partnership with something
Exactly.
on the table.
Exactly. While still always maintaining and respecting the autonomy, and the decision making is staying fundamentally with the client. But you have the meta to work with, which is why I love tools. I find that it's really, I would say, I kind of almost define my psychological life mission as giving psychology back to people. And in my case, it goes
Literally.
through the development of tools. Yes, it is giving psychology,
Yeah.
there we go, back to people, and goes through the development of tools as a means of collating good information, great information, and communicating in such a way that's easy for clients to play with and make decisions.
Right, so really important to always get the latest edition. You must be updating these parts quite a
Absolutely.
bit.
All the time. Yes.
Well,
Yes.
thank you for going through the pain of doing that. It feels quite bold to me to print something that well, in a couple of years' time, hopefully
Yeah.
it'll be bettered and updated,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, like for example, this Workup tool, we already printed something like 50 additional cards in addition to the 180 which are all in the box. So
Right.
because of the updates or changes, etc. And we're also trying to really make sure it's the science we're tracking, but also the practice we're tracking at the same time. What organizations are doing differently, for example, with the move to hybrid working, there are so many different solutions and rituals that are emerging, for example. So how do we integrate all of them to give your user lots of different ideas to play with, to create their own solutions? And again, knowing that whatever solution you're going to put in place, it is going to be temporary, because we know from research that the vast majority of the solutions we habituate to pretty fast. So whatever we put on the table, whatever we implement, probably a year later, 2 years later, a lot of them are not going to be quite as impactful at the same time. And so we keep really needing to change the solutions, change what it is that we are doing.
Would you give us a bit of the bandwidth of how coaches might utilize positive psychology? Could go, I'm hoping, or maybe we could go beyond your coaching style, because it seems to me that every coach uses positive psychology a little bit differently. So while you have your way of using it, for me, it more informs my question. I don't work with tools so much. Robert Biswas-Dean, our colleague and friend, said, well, we had him on the podcast here as well. That's probably for people also worth listening to. That he's kind of moved away from a positive psychology coaching that is a methodology to more, well, it informs the way I ask questions and what I'm curious about. So I'd love to just kind of lay out the landscape of how coaches could be utilizing positive psychology. Why is it worth looking into it, and how could it benefit their coaching?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think gamification and tangible tools is specifically my approach to positive psychology, and many people do follow it. But many people, yes, absolutely, they would just simply use positive psychology as something to inform how they ask questions, what type of questions they ask. And I think Robert is a very good example of that. So, and also obviously not just how you ask the question, but also perhaps using the positive psychology to even examine your own prejudices, for example, to examine your own development, for example, as a coach. So you can always see, I mean, when you're talking about working on strengths, it's even like question yourself. I mean, how many strengths can you name as a coach? Or
what's your strength as a coach?
Exactly, or what are your strengths as a coach? Absolutely. I mean, you're talking about well-being. What do you believe well-being to be, and how does your own intuition about well-being may interfere with the definitions of well-being out there, or with, let's say, your coaching, if your own belief runs counter to the beliefs of your clients, etc. So that may be another approach to use it. I'll give you another perhaps idea, which is very much question-based idea and a framework-based idea, coming very much from positive psychology. So, you know, obviously you would know the idea of psychological capital, right? And the whole concept of psychological capital. And I really love this concept. So what psychological capital is basically the idea that there are 4, potentially even 5 components that are very closely intercorrelated between themselves and fundamentally describe not the physical, not the financial, not the social, but rather the psychological capital of a person. And these components are hope, self-efficacy, resilience, optimism, and also potentially some authors argue mindfulness can be added to the mix. So these are the components that basically, if you develop the skills and capacities, and all of them can be developed, it means we just function better when we are faced with setbacks, or we obtain our goals better and easier, we study better, we perform better, etc. So there is quite a lot of research behind it. And I always struggled with how do we really translate it into something kind of coachable, you know? And one day, playing with the idea, I realized that actually the whole concept of psychological capital can be translated into a coaching model, you know, like we have grow model, or we have different stages we go through. In fact, psychological capital in itself can be seen as a model that you go through in different questions. So already what helps is that all these 4 components or 5 components can be added into an acronym: mindful hero, mindfulness and hope, efficacy, resilience, optimism. And now you take this mindful hero and you use it as a framework, as a process model for coaching questions. So let's give you an example. Let's say you ask your client to work or select on a basically challenge situation, transformational goal, and you use this mindful hero process. So mindful would be really almost assessing the here and now, what's happening for right now, what's going on, what change that's waiting to happen, what is it you want to work on specifically. And hope would be all the questions around the objectives. So what do you hope for? What's your goal? Where would you like to go? How can you get there? Is there perhaps another way to get there? Maybe another way to get there. What will motivate you to start? And we're basically using hope theory here to generate questions. Then you have the stage of efficacy, which is really confidence. So how do you feel about the journey? How confident do you feel about going and on this journey specifically? Then resilience is really about preparing for setbacks. So what difficulties are you likely to encounter along the way? How can you be best prepared for these difficulties, for these obstacles, for example? What resources do you have or can you build to prepare for these eventual difficulties? Then you go into optimism, which is, what do you need to really do or believe to ensure the result is positive, basically? What sort of mindset do you need to use to make sure that you really can be successful in this journey? Are you ready now to sort of step into the unknown? What your first step would be? And then I'll come back to sort of the present moment, the mindfulness. What do you need to be mindful of? What are you paying attention to now? What do you need to be paying attention to, for example? So I'm actually translating that model into the coaching model.
Yeah, and
Would that rock?
there's so many good examples out there, because almost every model that's been studied, you can actually look at that through a coaching lens and think,
Absolutely.
oh, here's a number of questions I could be asking. They don't even have to be each individually recognized through a piece of research as questions, how we would do it in research, right? This question, we know with a degree of
Yeah.
confidence that this question really goes into the heart of
Yeah.
knowing things about it. We don't need to
Absolutely.
be that exact. It's great. I think it's more effective when we're that exact based on
Yeah.
research. But for example, I went through a workshop with Judith Mangelsdorfer, who's a Berlin here, colleague from Berlin, around post-ecstatic growth. When we had a really ecstatic experience, we can guide someone through a coaching process to recognize what they have learned from this. Same with post-traumatic growth.
Excellent.
Just because there's a piece of adversity or something really difficult that has happened, doesn't mean that we can't grow from this. So
Absolutely.
I've had that also around flow, for example, engagement, more engagement at work, or any positive psychological concept. Well, I wrote this chapter with Michael Steger, who you know very well, around meaning at work, meaning in the workplace. Oh, you co-edited that book, of course.
Yes.
So
Yes, I did.
we took two of his models around how we
Yeah.
can work with meaning in the workplace, and then conceptualize coaching questions that any coach
Absolutely.
can ask around it. And this is
Absolutely.
we can follow a methodology
Yeah.
with coaching, positive psychology coaching research. We can also look
Exactly.
at positive psychology models and concepts. And as a coach, figure out, what can I ask around this topic? And yes, you are
Absolutely.
bringing guidance in, but that is based on things that we know, and we're not attached to it.
Absolutely.
But if somebody comes in with a coaching topic that is relatively specific,
Yeah.
there's a ton there with good research evidence that easily translates, or has already been translated, into a number of coaching questions. What a wonderful
Exactly.
toolbox.
Exactly. And so in fact, it is really quite straightforward if you kind of change your perspective a little bit and just really see how you can possibly operationalize everything that you know from positive psychology and bring it to coaching to make an impact. So yeah. And these are really good examples that by the way, I really do like your chapter. So with Michael Steger, it was a really, really, really excellent chapter, and very much important for everybody to read, because I think meaning at the moment, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure you would agree with me, it's actually one of those topics and questions that many people coming back to, especially after COVID. What am I here for? Am I really doing what I'm meant to be doing? And or would the solution be elsewhere? So in terms of both recruitment, retention, talent development, I would say that meaning has become one of the really key questions nowadays.
Yeah, and there's so many different ways to work with it, right? If we work
Absolutely.
on meaning through a positive psychological lens, we might approach the work a little bit differently. And
Exactly.
I think that's the difference here. Everybody can go through a find your why sort of workshop, but if we work with positive psychological tools, there's a ton of research behind it. Right?
Absolutely.
And also character strengths go to the heart of why we do things. I mean, the values in action, VIA, right? They point to our values and virtues, but as they come out in everyday practice.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Do you have any other favorite application areas of positive psychology? Might there be a time in your coaching where you thought, oh, this was really effective that we might have not talked about yet?
Probably one last example is, and I know depending on the country, some people actually using it a lot, and some people are very much new to using it. So I'm still, you can see, very passionate about gamification in one way or another. So one thing I use a lot is Lego series play in coaching. So, and I have even written a book with Matt Babb about the use of Lego series play in positive psychology, but also as applying to coaching specifically as well. So this is something I'm very passionate about. And I would say, to begin with, it was not even considered that coaching can benefit from Lego series play, because Lego series play, for those people who don't know, is a methodology which is very much being used nowadays in training solutions, in training or in group coaching. But actually, I would say at the same time is having experimented it in coaching, it's pretty successful. It's pretty effective as well. You don't necessarily just need to wait for the opportunity to use it in a group. You can use it just with one individual, and even with one individual working online. You can always ask him to get a bit of Lego and start building whatever they're thinking about, explaining model to you. Yeah.
So that's on a side note. You would get a piece, like a starter piece of Lego series play, but it could be absolutely anything. You're basically building a constellation of something. So
absolutely.
It's playful, it's hands-on, it's
Yeah.
creative. And I always thought, what? You're gonna take Lego into a group of, senior managers? But
absolutely.
they almost always really get very seriously involved. And it's a wonderful way to get people to focus in on something that otherwise they might have missed because they're in their usual way of thinking.
Exactly. It's extremely, I would say, extremely successful and extremely effective as an intervention. Absolutely love doing it because, again, this is really autonomous. You can ask the client to build their current difficulty, current objective, current possible solutions. And then by explaining that model, they usually realize there was something they've already built that gives them another idea or another perspective. So it actually enables them to really think out of the box, and that's great.
Yeah. Really interesting. Is that book out already?
Oh, that one is actually been out for quite a while. So it's basically using positive psychology and Lego series play together, positive psychology and Lego series play. And I can send you a PDF if you want to share.
I'd quite like to.
Yes.
Would that be okay if we share that for the podcast?
Yes, it will be okay
amazing.
for you to share it on the podcast. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, of course.
We put that in the show notes in some way. If we haven't, please remind us.
Okay. Yes.
Not you, the people listening to this.
I understand. We're just actually talking about Germany. I've just been doing a workshop on Lego series play and for coaching and consultancy and training in Germany, in Berlin, for the Congress of German Psychological Association, Psychological Association, and it worked extremely well together with other tangible tools as well.
They just celebrated 10 years.
I was there.
I've met them last week, just the Monday after.
Yeah, I was there during the weekend.
Oh, wonderful. Shame I missed it. I wasn't around.
And painted Berlin Wall.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Anything else that you think would be helpful for coaches out there not very familiar with positive psychology to know, either conceptually or maybe where can they go to kind of open more doors? Do you have favorite resources or something that you really want to offer people for the way?
Yes, I think probably I would recommend our book with Susie Green and Wendy Smith, Positive Psychology Coaching in the Workplace. So I don't know if you have that around.
I have that.
I do have it around, but not here. You have it there, me too, there. So it's a very, very good book in terms of you really wanted to have lots of really practical ideas. That would be a good way to start. if you are into tools, do have a look. And obviously, I don't want to advertise myself too much, but you're welcome to have a look at the Positron website. Positron is positivetransformation.eu for English language, or .fr for French language, or lots of different tools. But I would say probably a good starting point is really this book, because it's extremely comprehensive. It probably has chapters from all the best practitioners of positive psychology coaching from around the world at the moment. And they're very practically oriented chapters. They're not just theoretical. So there's theoretical underpinning, but also very much practical application. So probably that would be a very good starting point for people to look at.
Got a case study in every chapter.
It's got case studies. Yeah.
I would add to that Susie Green's and Stephen Palmer's book from a good couple of years earlier, which is Positive Psychology Coaching in Practice. So
Yes.
For those of you who don't operate in the workplace, I think it's still worth reading how it's being applied in the workplace, because often the principles are not very different.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
that might give people a bit of a broader view in as well. And I would recommend your book from way back when, Positive Psychology in a Nutshell, which you have
yes, of course.
updated a couple of times. I think that's a really comprehensive introduction that you can probably read in an afternoon. Yes,
exactly. It's quite nutshell-like. So that was a whole idea. But yes, it is still my favorite book out of everything I've done. So probably because it was the first, but anyway. And perhaps the last one is probably the first one is my favorite, and the last one, which is a positive psychology coaching and in a workplace, which is also quite good, I think.
That's very psychologically grounded, right? Primary and recency effect.
Yes, exactly.
Talking to a psychologist.
Exactly. Thank you for explaining it to all our listeners. Yes, great.
Cool. Ilona, unless you have any parting words, I would close here and would thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Cool. And good luck for everything that you're doing. Please keep doing it. The world needs more positive psychology, and I know many coaches will benefit from this. So appreciate your time, and until we meet again.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you.
To watch these episodes on video, make sure you also check out youtube.com/animascoaching. See you back here soon.